Hi, welcome to my live stream, and today I'm going to be building a PC for the purposes of video editing, which is why this is a live stream and not something that I've edited. As it says in the description, I've not built a PC for about 25 years. The last time I did, the magic smoke disappeared from the inside of the PC. Unfortunately, I had a faulty case, and there was a problem in that case and all of those cases, because I tried multiple of them and they all suffered from the same problem with the speaker wire melting. Hopefully this time I'm not going to have any big problems. There's no speaker wire in this PC, but it's very different from what I used to build 25 years ago. I've been a Mac user for roughly 20 years. That's probably not going to change. I still really like the Mac. But I need another PC to do some additional work on. And so I'm going to build it. This is the processor that I've chosen. An AMD Ryzen 3600 6-core processor. Mostly just because of the value proposition it offers. This was purchased for £180, which is the best sort of price I could find. I found it on Curry's PC World. You can get it for the same price at the moment on Amazon, and there's a link in the video description for all of the parts that I'm using, all from Amazon. They're all at pretty much the price I paid. Some are a little bit cheaper. So I've paired the Ryzen with an ASRock B550M Pro 4 motherboard, simply because it was around the price I wanted to spend. I paid about £100 for this. You can now pick them up for about 80. It's got PCI Express 4, not that I'm going to be using it. The motherboard is a mini ITX, though I have an ATX case for it to go in. But it makes sense. It's got some expandable features for later. I'm not going to be filling this absolutely full. I'm not going to be using all of the features, but it was a good balance of modern chipset, expandable into the future if I need it, but not too expensive that I wouldn't mind replacing it with something later on. Comes with a SATA cable, 2 M.2 screws, a CD, there's a manual that I've already taken and reviewed, the I/O shield, and then the motherboard. So it's a fairly simple motherboard, not huge amount to it, no integrated I/O shield. This is a budget board, so there's just the standard I/O. There's no 10 gig or 2.5 gig Ethernet on this. It's a relatively sensible board for the kind of use that I want to put to it. The CPU, I'll be using the stock cooler from this. The CPU has not been opened. I haven't tested any of this kit yet. You're going to see me testing all of it as I go along. And I'm going to build it on the board, on the cardboard box, because lots of people in other build videos say that that's a good idea. So the first thing I'm going to do is mount the CPU, but the CPU cooler doesn't require these brackets. The CPU cooler is here, and as you can see, thermal compound is intact on there, and this screws in. So the motherboard has a backing plate that this will be screwing into, and I'll be removing these two brackets. These are fairly easy to remove, thankfully. Last screw. And without picking the board up, because the mounting plate comes through, I don't want to have to fish that back through. Open the processor and locate the triangle and just drop the processor in. It's fallen in really easily, which is cool. And then push down with the lever. Well, so far this has been really easy compared to installations of old, which is probably going to be the death knell of this build, because I've now jinxed it. The CPU cooler is really easy to line up. The screw holes just drop in. And these are tension screws. They have springs. Doing one side then the other. In an X pattern. Just to make sure that I don't over tighten. And the last one. So now the CPU is firmly attached to the motherboard, and I can attach the CPU fan header, which is just a little 4-pin one here, to CPU fan 1 on the motherboard. And just tuck that out of the way. So the next item in my build is the memory. I've purchased the Corsair Vengeance DDR4 LPX 3200 megahertz memory. This was pretty much the best value item without going for something that was rated for huge overclocking. I'm not going to be trying to squeeze every last bit out of this PC, so I don't feel the need to overclock hugely. I'll be putting the memory into these two slots. I just noticed that the CPU cooler would probably have been better mounted the other way around, because this lug gets in the way of one of the slots. Hopefully that won't get in the way of the second one, but if necessary I will move it round. And inserting the memory, lining up the notch, It seems to be in. It's flat across the entire board. And the second, and there we go. That's the memory and the CPU already. These are really scarily easy to build these days. The next item is the M.2 SSD. This on this board can be installed on the PCI Express 4 lane or a PCI Express 3 lane here. You may also notice an M.2 socket here, but that's only for Wi-Fi, and it's an extremely short style. This board doesn't have sockets that are screwed or keyed for anything other than the 80mm SSDs. And it does come with this heat spreader heatsink. I'm actually planning not to use this. There's a link in the video below, or link in the video description below, which explains why. This is not going to be a heavily used machine. It's not a machine with a big video card in it yet, so I don't think that there's a huge amount of requirement. So I'm using one of the small screws that came with the motherboard for the M.2 rather than these slightly longer ones which are designed to fit through the shield. The SSD I've chosen is the Sabrent Rocket NVMe PCIe M.2. I've gone for a 1TB drive. This was around £120 on Amazon. The reason I've gone for this one is the mix of price and performance it offers. It's TLC NAND, so doesn't suffer the slow performance of QLC NAND, and it was a near unbeatable value for me. The SSD does have one of these copper heat spreaders on. That's another reason why I'm not taking the included heatsink, because those heat spreaders would need to be removed. It is only a single side, so this literally clips in and is screwed down. And unfortunately, it appears that the spreader needs to be used. This is one of those times when you need to change your decision. It needs to be used because the standoff has extra room, which would allow the SSD to wobble around, which is something I don't really want. So I will use the spreader after all, and I will remove the tape from it, and place it down and screw it back in. There we go, nice and secure. The quite literally last item that I'm going to be putting onto this machine. I don't have a new video card. As many people know, video cards are extremely difficult to get hold of. There's been a lot used for mining, and we just are struggling with the value proposition of video cards right now. So I have an old, this is an Asus 710 with 2 gig of memory. This was in a previous machine that I'm replacing. It was perfectly serviceable for basic desktop use. Hopefully it won't be too bad for video editing. This does have some of the required CUDA cores that are needed for acceleration, and I have performed some testing with video encoding, and it does go faster than the old processor used to. I don't know how much it's going to help a faster processor like the Ryzen, but we'll give it a go. So I will use, even though it isn't a full-length card, I will use the PCIe 4 slot, just because it's directly connected to the motherboard, and this way it doesn't have to go through the extra chipset. So that's pretty much the motherboard, the PC. The only thing left is to try and power this up and give it a test. For the power supply, I've decided on a Corsair TX550M. This is a mid-range power board PSU. It is partially modular. The reason I went with partially modular is because all of these cables pretty much won't be needed. The only cables I believe I'm going to need are the cables that are captive on the PSU. So the PSU contains the ATX and the CPU power, which will go directly to the motherboard. It also comes with some screws and some cable ties. The mains lead that came with this, I have already plugged in, and it's waiting. So let's uncable tie this. It's very, very well organized. And I actually need that on the other side. On this board, the CPU and the ATX are around this way. And we'll plug in the ATX first. So is keyed this way. With the clip, and the same on the CPU power. Now, to power this on, the power button connector is over here. It's a little bit awkward to get to, and although some popular YouTubers may be comfortable with jabbing a knife or something against those pins, that's not something I'm yet comfortable with, so I will actually use the case. The case I have chosen is the Fractal Designs Define C. It is a very simple case looks wise, which is the main reason I went for it. I'm not a great fan of glass, just from a safety point of view and a noise point of view. It's difficult to noise insulate with glass. So instead, I have a solid case which includes an amount of noise insulation. I'm just looking for the power switch lead. Here it is. Hopefully labelled power switch. I don't know if you can see that. And the power switch, I will just double check the manual. The power button, as they call it, connects here. So this is, in theory, all that I need. I have a monitor waiting just to the side over here, and I will plug that in to the HDMI, and I will plug the power cable into the PSU, turn the PSU on and push the power button. And that's hopefully a good sign. This is the nervous part for me. And we have life. We have the AS Rock logo, and the computer wants a boot device. So it looks like it's worked. So back to the desk, and we will power down and we'll disconnect and isolate everything. Now we can get on to the fun of mounting all of this into the case. And just place the motherboard to one side for now, while we go over what the case includes. So the top of the case has front audio reset power, which has a tiny peel. Still satisfying even though it's tiny. The only piece of plastic peel in this entire build, unfortunately, and 2 USB 3. The side of the case opens with 2 thumb screws. These are slightly cheap thumb screws. they are a little awkward to get into the holes on the case. They feel as if you might be mashing them. And the case is extremely light, even more so when both the sides are off, because the sides contain the sound deadening material. There's a mesh top and a solid top. If you're running radiators, the mesh top is a great idea. You can get more fans, you can get the radiator in the front, radiator in the top. It would be quite a well-cooled case, but I'm going to be running with the two provided fans from Fractal. There's a front intake fan and a rear output fan. I will be leaving these in the same places. This should provide enough airflow for the single processor I have. On the other side, we have cable management with cable management grommets. There's a bay for mounting 2.5-inch drives to. I'm not going to be mounting any drives, so this will come out and stay out. There are also, at the base of the case, underneath all of these wires, there are drive sleds for mounting a 3.5-inch drive, and these have nice rubber grommets so that the drive can be mounted and noise isolated. Again, I'm not actually installing any, but I'll be leaving those drives in the bay there. The power supply is attached via the usual connector with the same thumb screws. And on this case, in the front and underneath, there are some nice grills to help with reducing the amount of dust and fluff that gets sucked into your machine. Because for now this machine is going to be installed in a room with carpet and it's going to sit on the floor, I'll be installing the power supply pointing up in the case, because this fan is going to suck air in and out through the back. And I lied, I've just seen another piece of peel over the Corsair logo. That's nice. So, first thing is I shall be mounting the installation bracket onto the power supply. The case comes with a small packet which includes all of the screws that they believe you'll need, and a standoff tool, and we'll see why that's important in just a minute. So the first 4 screws also come with a number of cable ties, and this mounting bracket can only go on one way. We just screw this in, actually making sure that we choose the right screws. Yep, power supply screws, 4 of. It feels rather tight, which is why I backed off. I didn't want to try threading the screw through into something it wasn't going to accept. That one worked a little better. Now, my personal choice for a semi-modular power supply, everyone is going to use these two leads. Everyone needs a CPU and everyone needs motherboard power. But not everybody needs power for everything else, especially if you're not using a big graphics card, if you're not using RGB lighting. There's not necessarily going to be the need to have a load of extra power in the machine. So, the next step, according to Fractal's user guide, is to install the power supply. Now, the power supply is more easily accessed through the other side. Drag these out of the way for now. And as I said, I'm going to be mounting this fan side up. So the leads are going to come in and then just tighten the two thumb screws. And here is a great example of how these thumb screws do not feel great on initial threading. The next step, according to Fractal, is to prepare the motherboard. We've already done that because we've tested it. So, the next step is to install the I/O shield. Now, the I/O shield only goes in one way. In this one, you can see these two holes. These are unused on the motherboard I've got, but they are designed to take a Wi-Fi antenna, and you can add the Wi-Fi antenna later along with the little M.2 card that I showed you. So we'll just push the shield in, and this is where I am most likely to sacrifice a little blood to the gods of PC build. There we are. The next item is to install the standoffs that the motherboard is going to install onto. There's one in the middle here that is already installed. This is not a threaded standoff, this just provides some support. And on this motherboard, with the motherboard going in the machine this way round, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 under the GPU, 6, 7, and as I mentioned, this standoff here is not a threaded one. There is a welded on stand there. So we'll take our bag of standoffs and this useful little tool, which, if you can see, contains a hex and on the other side a Phillips. The hex can take the standoff, and the Phillips just your regular screwdriver. So the first standoff goes up here, and then the next two here and here. And these screw in pretty easily. It's difficult to over tighten, but you do need to keep them in tight because you don't want to find them wobbling around when you're installing the motherboard. The next is here, where the GPU will be sat. And the next one is in a line aligned with this last one here. And there's multiple options for mounting a motherboard in this case. It does take up to ITX. And then the last is here, and one slightly further below. So the case does come with more standoffs than are needed for this motherboard, but if you have a longer board, you might require all of the standoffs. And that's all of our motherboard standoffs in place. Now we can, having removed the GPU, we can offer the motherboard up, lining up, and you should be able to just make out maybe this integrated standoff has dropped in, and these ones we can now see the brass threads through. The next pack is a pack of 8 motherboard screws. So again, we'll go in. This time we're going to start with the closest, and I'm guessing these just tight enough that they bite, but not so tight that they're going to crush the motherboard. As you know, I'm not putting a huge GPU in this at the moment, although I might get one later depending on the video encoding performance. And now the last screw at the back, right at the back at the top. That's the motherboard now fully installed. And it doesn't fall out when I stand this up. The next thing we need to do is start routing some of these cables. And we know that the CPU power is at the top, at the back here. So the easiest way to route this is through the grommet at the top. And the ATX power is along on this side. So that will get routed similarly through that grommet there. This case also has a USB-C header. As standard, all of the cables are routed through to the bottom, but the USB-C header, or the USB 3 header, sorry, which I want to use is towards the middle. So I'm going to route that connector, it's the blue one that you see there, through that middle grommet. And pretty much everything else is routed along the bottom. So they will also be routed through that middle grommet. And I will pass them all the way through to allow me to set the machine back on the bench. So the first cable, this CPU power supply, goes on, as does the ATX. There is a front audio header which is keyed. You might be able to make out that there is a hole missing. Equally, on the board there is a connector marked HD audio that has the same pin missing pattern. So that is easy to locate and put on, and we'll push all of the cable back through the grommet to make it tidy. The next items are a little bit fiddly, and they all sit at this bottom connector here. They consist of the power LED, the power switch, the reset switch, and the hard drive LED, which I will be plugging in, even though I don't have a hard drive. And as you can see here, this is one of many connectors at the bottom. It's a good idea to review the motherboard manual just to make sure that you get the right pins the right way round. This is the manual for this board, and as you can see there is again a pin missing. So locate the pin missing and orient your manual the same way, so that when you're reviewing this, and just crack the spine of the manual so that it lies flat. When you're reviewing this, you can easily see where everything needs to go. So the first two closest to me on the right hand side are the power LED plus and then minus. These two are slightly different from the other in that they are separate separate leads. These two come as two separate leads rather than a block of two. So the first one, power LED plus, slides over, and then the second one, power LED minus, slides over. And this is where having stubby fingers really doesn't help. The next item moving along is the power button and ground. Now if you notice here that the power button and the ground and the reset button and the ground are swapped over. This prevents you from accidentally connecting the power button and the reset switch to each other, and a ground to each other, and then the button not working at all. So you can plug these in. You can plug these in side by side like this, or side by side this way, and they will still work. So reset switch, I'm going to put along, and the power button I am going to put alongside it. And the last is the hard drive LED, which I'm just putting in to keep the cabling tidy and to not have too many cables just cable tied up out of the way. The next item are the fans, and this fan here has a handy header already in place. On this motherboard it does have the 4-pin PWM connectors, but the case fans are only 3-pin. In this case, that means you plug into pins 1, 2 and 3. They are all marked up, and there is a retaining lip alongside them, so there's no need to worry about plugging 3 things into a socket made for 4. And I'm just moving the cabling out of the way there temporarily. And this front fan, the front fan's header is actually chassis fan over here. So that's the one cable I didn't pass through. And I'll pass that. I've dropped a cable tie. pass that through the bottom. And the cable tie falls out, which is good. And I'll pull this one through and plug this one in, lining up these 2 notches with the stand, and that's all of the cabling needed for this PC. It doesn't look, no it's not, there's one more thing. There's this USB header. Now USB header for USB 3, those are little surrounded blocks. They are quite delicate, so I'm not going to be pulling on this lead. That lead will be left where it is. These leads are all going to be pulled through and cable tied in the back of the PC. So we pull each one of these very gently. And then flip the case back round and encourage the last few bits of cable through. We can see we have a little slack, but we also have these helpfully positioned cable ties that are pre-installed into the case. It just helps keep all of this nice and tidy. And I think, other than the GPU, we are basically done. The GPU, as you saw before, it is double height internally, but it's not double height externally. So we only need to remove a single slot at the back. The slot covers are thumb screws, but this top position is not particularly accessible as a thumb screw. And a little bit of pressure and the GPU is installed. There we go. And before we put any more of the case on, we'll perform another quick test. Plugging in the power and the HDMI. I'm also going to plug in on the rear a wireless USB mouse and keyboard, so that I can get access to the BIOS, hopefully. And power on the keyboard. A little white light. power supply on, front button, and both the cable fans are spinning. And as you can see, we have a booting machine. So let's reboot. And I'm mashing the delete key to get into the BIOS. We have a Ryzen 550 6-core processor, which is exactly what it's got, 3.6 gigahertz, 16 gig of RAM in slots A2 and B2. I'm not going to be using any of the overclocking. I won't be using the on board other than to check the SATA is all not present, and we have a Sabrent 1 terabyte NVMe drive. The board does support RGB and it supports instant flash, so you can flash the BIOS without needing to have booted into an operating system at all. And the motherboard temperature at the moment, 27 degrees. It is slightly warm in this room, and a CPU temperature of 50. And as you can see, we have 1, 2, 3 fans spinning with very little noise. Boot option 1, NVMe Sabrent. We will be putting a USB in here to get an operating system. But first, let's have a look at closing the case up. As I mentioned, the top of the case can be removed. There's a single clip which pulls the top out. The top of the case has some sound deadening, very much like the sound deadening material that is on the side of each side, or on the inside of each side. And this little filter grill, which is probably more to stop things from falling in than it is to stop things from getting dusty, because hopefully you'll be using radiator and fans pushing up. That fits on top with a strip of magnets around. You can't touch from the other side because of this mesh, but there are some large holes for fan mounting. It can take either a 120 or a 140 fan. You can, in theory, put 3 fans in the front, I believe 2 fans in the top, 1 fan in the back. And the lid just snaps back into place. The sides are identical. They are rotatable, so you don't need to remember which side is which. You can put either side on. These fiddly thumb screws are getting at me again. And there we are. One finished PC. Move these out of the way slightly. And try and give you a view of the monitor. The next thing I need to do is plug in my Windows boot disk, put my keyboard down and power the machine back up. I am very happy with the level of noise. This is a really quiet machine, which was what I was hoping for. This is replacing a Hewlett-Packard G6 server, which was horrendously noisy. Sorry about the wobbly video. There we go. Windows installer, language English UK. Next, and install now. I have no idea just how long this will take to install, and I'm going to hide the screen while I get my Windows key. Sorry about this. And I will accept the license terms and hit next. We're going to do a custom Windows install on drive 0, which is the 1TB drive, and let Windows get on with its installation. I have not installed Windows to an NVMe drive before, so I really don't know how fast this is likely to be. So while that's getting on, and we're at 24%, I'll just quickly review what I did, how I went about it. The first order of business was to check the motherboard, check the processor, the memory, the SSD, on the bench. I've been watching a lot of Jay's 2 Cents and Linus Tech Tips recently, and the number of times things have gone wrong, and my own personal experience with previous build, that for me was an important step. I would encourage everyone to do it if you can. Once the system was known to boot, then I set about dealing with the case. The build was follow through the instructions in in the user guide. Fractal's instructions are really simple. They're fully diagrammed with everything you need highlighted in blue. And Windows has finished its initial installer step. It has rebooted already. It's probably one of the quickest installs I've ever seen. There's a builder's guide, optional steps, additional info, and support. I've only gone through the builder's guide. The optional steps, they cover such items as replacing the magnetic dust filter, removing the PC shroud, which is required if you need to remove or relocate the lower drive bays. It also goes into detail of where you can add an additional 3.5-inch drive. That doesn't make a huge amount of sense to me. The way that they install it is the additional drive goes where the drive cages would be. So why not use the drive cage? Additional info goes into the fan locations. They do mention the possibility of putting 120mm fans. There's 7 of them. You have 1 in the back, 2 at the top, 3 in the front, and 1 in the bottom. I wouldn't recommend a fan in the bottom pulling air in, but possibly pulling air out. Then 140mm fans, where you can have 2 at the top and 2 at the back. There's a section on water cooling radiator options. You can use up to a 280mm, I believe, or possibly a 360mm. It's not totally clear as to what the blue indicates in this manual. And it gives a couple of ideas about where to place them, and also details on dust maintenance. Now, they recommend that you either hand wash or vacuum out the dust filters. It does have information on the height of the CPU cooler and the length of the graphics card. You can fit a graphics card of 315mm if you've got a front fan, or 335mm if you have no fan in the way. So Windows is now asking me to go through the basic setup. And yes, we are in the UK. We are going to use the UK keyboard layout, but no second. We don't have internet for now because we just want to get the machine running. Who will use this? I will. And we'll have a very memorable password. This isn't the usual password I would use. And Windows now wants some security questions. Obviously, I'm not going to show you those. The usual. What's the first name of your last teacher's second pet? And then the questions on speech recognition, location, find my device, diagnostic data. Do you want me to spy on you with typing? Do you want tailored experiences, advertising ID, and then Cortana, for which we'll put no. And Windows is now getting everything ready for me. This might take several minutes. Hopefully it won't. Hopefully within the next minute or two we'll have a Windows PC up and running. All in, it's taken about an hour, but an hour's worth of time going through all of the details, I don't think it's too bad. I'm happy with the outcome of this. Well, that's my build. Hopefully over the next few weeks I can get this up and running as a video editing workstation and general office PC, and make another video, detail how it works, what I think of it, would I do it again? But until then, thank you very much for watching.